57 days until the election, and Congress is finally back in session. I'm back with Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky. He's the author, right here, Government Bullies. We were just talking, before we get to the book, we were just talking about the so-called Bush tax cuts. And it drives me nuts when I hear progressives. I said in the monologue that somewhere along the way, they decided that the Clinton-era tax rates were the fixed standard, maybe because Bill Clinton was popular, Republicans had taken over Congress. But doesn't it drive you nuts when they talk about letting a tax cut expire? We've had these rates for 11 years.
Right. So what they're really talking about is they would like to raise taxes, but they don't want to say they want to raise taxes. But the other thing they forget about, and we're still fighting about in Washington, is did the reduction in rates that Bush did that lower revenue? And actually didn't. Revenue stayed constant as a percentage of GDP for years. Revenue finally went down because we had a recession. So if you want to get revenue up, you don't want to raise rates. You want the economy to grow. And the economy's not going to grow if you raise taxes. So they just don't get it. I mean, we fundamentally are at odds between their party and our party because they think raising taxes is the answer, and I think it'll be a disaster for us as a country.
Well, they don't actually have to raise taxes all the time. I mean, in your book, you talk about the EPA. The EPA, without any legislation, has imposed so many regulations that amount to a tax, a regulation here, a regulation there. The cost of compliance gets passed on to consumers and makes everything more expensive.
Well, you know what worries me is, you know, when Obama was talking to Medvedev to talk to Putin, he says, wait till after the election. I'll have more freedom after the election. What about regulations? Can you imagine what he's going to do to the utility industry, to the oil and gas industry?
He said he was going to bankrupt the coal industry.
Yeah, but can you imagine what happens? He's been restrained so far. Can you imagine what happens to him when he doesn't have to worry about any more elections? It scares me to death, and it scares business to death. Business is terrified. I've been reading a couple books about the Great Depression, Amity Shlaes, The Forgotten Man, Benjamin Anderson. People have written about the Depression. Everything they say in there could apply to this president. Business was terrified. Business sat on the sidelines. Business was worried about taxes going up. I mean, that's what's going on now. We can't get moving as a country because they're afraid of what he'll do next.
Now, I think the quote in this book about American citizens being unable to challenge the EPA in a court of law is a huge problem and sums up government bullying. Fundamentally, in the Constitution, you're right, it's not about an opinion. Life and property cannot be taken without due process. If the government steps in and says, you're breaking the law, you're violating some regulation on wetlands, and you say, well, I want to go to court and challenge what a wetland is. So tell me, when I'm preparing this, what's a wetland? Well, it's whatever we say it is.
Well, and that was the amazing thing about one of the cases, and this is really what got me started in writing this book, was the case of Mike and Chantel Sackett. They live in Idaho. They buy a lot for $25,000. They're regular middle-class folks. They're not really rich. $25,000 for a lot. They put some gravel on it and begin building. The government says, hey, that's a wetlands, and they fine them $75,000 a day. And
$75,000 a day.
A day.
Per day.
But then they say, while the fines are accumulating, you have no recourse. Pick up the gravel and pick up the dirt and make the lot like it used to be and pay a fine to the Sierra Club, or we'll keep fining you. But then they have no recourse in court. So this works its way all the way to the Supreme Court. And fortunately, the Pacific Legal Foundation, which is a great property rights foundation, a nonprofit, fought their case for them because they wouldn't have had the money to do it. It would have cost millions of dollars. They fight it all the way to the Supreme Court. And you know, the Supreme Court's not all conservatives. You may have heard that.
Yeah,
you may have heard that.
I've heard that.
They voted 9-0 in favor of the Sacketts and said, my God, this is America. You can't take someone's property without having their day in court. So the Supreme Court demanded they have their day in court. And you know what the EPA did? They're still trying to get money out of them. They're going to get their day in court, but the EPA still is not willing to compromise on whether it's a wetlands or not.
So, but basically, if they didn't have the backing of this organization, the EPA could really bully. The government can bully you with expensive litigation. They could pour whatever resources they want into a court of law. They can have lawyers that aren't going to ever back off. And you and I, as American citizens, will go bankrupt trying to defend ourselves.
Think about that. You've got the monetary disadvantage against the behemoth that is the federal government. But then you've also got people populating these agencies now who are like that EPA official who says, let's crucify 5 or 6 businessmen at the beginning. They'll comply. It's the same throughout government. Why are we getting sort of the bullying at the airport with the TSA? Because they want you to submit. It's a little bit here and there. Last week, what is it? They want to stick their finger in your drink. They want to know what you're drinking in the airport. Is your water okay? Well, you're drinking the water. Probably okay, the water, you know, but they want to test your water after you've gone through security. They want to do an invasive search on your 6-year-old children. It really, we're letting our freedom go little by little. Someone's got to say no.